Oh, where does the time go? All right, looks like it's already 9:30, so let's get this train wreck of a day going. All right, got two face-to-face. Seems to be dwindling a little bit, but that's all right. This class is kind of designed to just a bunch of different ways, and looks like we have one joining us online so far, so it's just kind of how week 2 goes today. So to start off today, we're kind of wrapping up our first module here called Identities and Social Structures. For the last 2 weeks, what we've really been doing is we've been trying to introduce a wide variety of social theory into our lexicon, so that way when we start to take a look at the history of urbanization, we kind of already have somewhat of a familiar feel with some of these things. Now, of course, the goal is to not master these things. We're really just scratching the surface. So when we arrive at various points in history, we can have a little better discussion on these things. So just to get us going for today, some announcements, opening circle, standard lecture kind of looking day. And today's activity is called Who Am I, which we'll be doing after the lecture. For those of you joining us virtually, if you would like to participate in today's activity after the lecture, there's a PDF available in week 2 on our Class Learn site. If you would like to go ahead and download that now or print it so that way you can participate along with us at the end of class. So just some quick announcements. We're constantly, of course, as you guys know, trying to get bigger, better, faster, stronger. I've already covered this a few times today that the reason I am live streaming classes is because I know there's a lot of various uncertainty on a lot of different levels. And even though this is supposed to be primarily a face-to-face class with 23 of you registered, of course, coming to campus during a pandemic is not always the wisest decision or best decision or even possible. And so that's why we're also incorporating the live stream. And so thank you very much for those of you who have been participating virtually. I know the audio has been rough since I've kind of been funding this with my own money and, again, doing this on my own. I'm constantly trying out new equipment. So I did notice on the last recording, because I do go back and watch these, is that my lapel mic does not do a very good job of picking me up through the mask. So this time I'm trying a Bluetooth headset that's made for a phone, except it's hooked up to the computer. So hopefully we'll get some better audio. And those of you who are watching these lectures, you know, late at night or you're not able to participate live, part of the live stream, hopefully that'll help you guys out too as well. So just to let you guys know, for anyone that is participating virtually, I've said this already that even though I can't necessarily keep up with the chat, you know, I do notice when you guys say good morning on the video, since I do go back and watch this. So those of you that do leave comments in the chat, and those of you who do say hi and offer comments, I am seeing those. It's just not live. So, and also if those of you that are participating virtually and watching these videos after the fact, you can also email me as well and play along with the class that way if you would like to feel a little bit more engaged. But due to technology limitations, you might not be able to. And so that's also an issue I did want to touch on as well, is that the reason we're also kind of doing this, which feels a little weird at times, because there are people in the classroom with us face to face, and then there's also people joining virtually, but there's also the possibility that, of course, you know, since this is New Mexico and we don't have a whole lot of infrastructure, that some people don't have internet at home and may actually be driving down to a coffee shop to watch these videos or submit their assignments after the fact. So the reason we're doing this also on YouTube is so that way it's much easier to engage in all these different varieties of ways. So those of you who have been following along with class virtually and dealing with the audio and the production, thank you very much. For those of you guys that keep showing up face to face every class, thank you very much, because this class is really designed to be face-to-face, primarily based on the need of the university. And so thank you all for playing along is basically what I want to say. And the reason I want to bring that up is because I think it's better to stumble a little bit now than, let's say, when cold and flu season comes along and like maybe we're forced to suddenly go fully online. At least we've worked out the kinks now rather than later. So thank you very much for all of that. I also wanted to let you guys know that I have graded idea journal number 1 that was due this past Sunday. I do make it a professional policy to try to leave, try to grade everything within 48 hours, because I know nothing is more frustrating than submitting an assignment and then wondering how you did on it even before the next one pops up. So As a personal practice there, I try to grade everything within 48 hours, and I also left you all individual feedback as well. And so if you're wondering how to maybe better structure the idea journals, the ways these can be built into the reflection and synthesis assignments, I left a lot of those comments there for you. So, and of course, you can always email me anything that you have regarding that as well. Any announcements for anyone in the class today? Yeah, there's not much going on. All right, so let's go ahead and kick this thing off. So for opening circle question, do parents have different hopes and standards for daughters than they do sons? Yes? How come? Or what's your opinion on that? So kind of growing up here in the New Mexico culture, you've definitely kind of noticed that there is a very kind of distinct set of rules that the daughters are given, certain expectations more so than the sons. Do you think that's kind of universal, or do you think that's kind of a local thing? It depends? Where do you think it depends? Yeah, sure. So context can play a really big role, right? Even in the same space. So the way that Indigenous kids are raised and sons and daughters and their expectations may not be the same as the broader New Mexico culture, even though we all share the same space. So different contexts have different effects on all of these things. So let's keep that in mind, and let's kind of keep that in the background as we kind of go through today's lecture. So to get started, today, since we're talking about individual and this broader idea of what a social identity is, today we're really just kind of scratching the surface as we unpack these things. And the reason I kind of said that at the beginning of class is because we at least want to be introduced to these concepts, even though we're just scratching the surface. So that way, like when we do get to certain points in history and we're wondering why they did the things they did and what they believed in, it's a little bit easier to make those associations. And so since next week, we actually begin kicking off and looking at cities in history. That's why today we kind of want to get an understanding of when we start to describe them physically, what they were actually like socially as well. And so since this is the end of kind of the first module in class, let's call back to the very first lecture we had, in which we kind of introduced this idea of dualism, that the way we typically evaluate the world around us is from a very dualistic nature, right? We say things are either good or bad. If you have one side, such as Democrats, you immediately have to have its antithesis in the form of the Republicans. Doesn't matter if it's coffee, tea, Coke, or Pepsi, right? So again, this class, what we're trying to do is we're taking a slightly different approach in that we're building from this idea that social complexities are not just one or the other. They actually need both in order to work. Now, certainly over history, we'll see that different sides of different arguments certainly can take control and dictate policy and procedure for quite some time. But eventually, there's always something that comes around that tries to balance it back out. And we've seen this when we were talking about in our second lecture, this idea of ages beginning and coming to an end, that something changed that made us say that the way we were choosing to live is not the way we wanted to keep going. So what we're trying to do is kind of understand what this means, because we as humans, even though we may think of ourselves as individuals today, didn't always necessarily have that concept of individuality. And so the way we tend to discuss the world around us is we like to think of it as a multi-actor social environment, right? So here's a photo of a classic Western bar fight scene, right? So here in the front, you got a couple guys playing cards. Looks like they're near the end of the game. The whiskey glass is near the bottom. Looks like they're about to go all in. Yet in the background here, you have this wild bar fight going on. And yet at the bar itself, you still have people socializing as well, as if nothing around them is going on. These guys are having a very intense moment, and then there's this whole fight scene going on right in the middle of everything. And so that is generally how today that we as individuals, even though there's a lot of chaos going on around us, are still kind of able to navigate this world and think of ourselves as individuals and also operate within this broader social environment. So when you think of yourself, the way that we consider the world around us is through these other entities. And so just some examples of these could be you and your relationship to church, to religion, you and your relationship to work, to school, how you are at home. So the way that you act at work is not necessarily the way that you are acting at home, but you are also still the same person. So when you're maintaining individuality, you tend to navigate this larger world around you. But then you can also have multi-actor within multi-actor, and of course you can really drill down into some philosophical nuances, right? So even though you are you, and you have a relationship, let's just say with the church through your religious organizations, maybe you're considering the religious roles of men and women versus the modern roles. So maybe you as an individual, even though you are part of this community, have internal conflict because maybe your organization lays out a different role for a woman than you actually want to have in your own life. Same thing with work, whether or not there's more men or women in the workplace and how you identify. At home, are you a stay-at-home mom or dad? Right, the world is kind of shifting quite a bit where being a stay-at-home dad is kind of a normal thing right now, but still susceptible to certain social injustices, outrages, right? Same thing with school. Are your educators representative of the student body? And so I've touched on this before, where I've noted that one of the unique things about the University of New Mexico is we are a majority minority institution, meaning there's more people of color here than those who identify as white. But yet our professors, because of the university system, universities frown upon cannibalizing their own students, meaning that if you graduate with a PhD from the University of New Mexico, it's frowned upon that you actually go back and teach for the University of New Mexico. And the reason for that is it kind of is instilled in some classic institutional ideas about the broader spreading of knowledge, incorporating new ideas into institutions. And so even though the University of New Mexico has this really unique student body, the people teaching us don't necessarily reflect that larger student body. And so you as an individual, even though you really wanted to come to school here because, I mean, here in New Mexico, it's just kind of the social expectation that you will go to UNM to stay closer to your family rather than going to a school back east. But are your educators representative of you? So when you are navigating this larger social world, even as an individual, you can really get into some nuances here. Now, the really challenging thing that can even make this more difficult to discuss is that even though we identify with certain groups, doesn't mean that we all have that universal group experience, right? So if I'm Native American and somebody else in the class also identified as Native American, yes, we absolutely come together in a group identity, but that doesn't mean we have even the same culture whatsoever, right? So me being Ojibwe out of Minnesota, if someone was from the Dene Nation here in front of me, even though we share one similarity, we have completely different life experiences. So even though you belong to the same social group, everyone within a culture is a little bit different. And you can even put this on several different levels. So just as an example, if you are a woman, does not necessarily mean that you have the same common experience as other women. Same thing for men, same thing as LGBTQ+, right? So whatever you identify as, you can definitely come together as a social group. But that doesn't mean you're immediately roped into that same experience or background. And so let's try to separate this a little bit from three different aspects within academia that have taken a look at this. And the first aspect of identity expression is this idea of nomenclature. And essentially what this is the name or the names of the member and how they select or choose to call themselves. So for example, here in New Mexico, we have the Santo Domingo Pueblo, which is located just north of us on I-25. But that's supposed to be a K. My bad. That's a bad spelling on my part. But the local community might also refer to themselves as Kewa. And so how is it that two different names can exist for people of the same group? And if you go into that community and say, wow, Santo Domingo is a beautiful place. No, that's not our name. We're Kewa. You can literally go into the next establishment and say, the community of Kewa is beautiful. It's like, no, we're Santo Domingo. And so even here in New Mexico, it's important to pay attention to how people self-identify themselves, or the label that they choose. But the interesting question is who decides on the name that these groups use? We even have instances of history where derogatory names were first given to a set of people, but then they repatriated that name back into the culture to actually make it positive, as a positive representation. For example, the term queer back in the 70s was a very derogatory term, but in the 90s, people who identified as part of that culture started to take that name back and actually associate it with a positive reference. And we can certainly see this in several groups throughout history. We also have this idea of heritage. So even though you may belong to a group that labels itself, what are your stories? What are your cultural elements, your experiences? How do your actual social members within the group define themselves or even understand their ethnical background? So heritage can be a separate form of identity expression. And there's also this idea of private and public. Is there a difference between the way you privately identify, or is there a separate way that you publicly identify yourself? And so when we're kind of thinking of these three different ways that we express our identity, the thing that can kind of make this more complicated is because we are living in an age of technology that no other generation has really had accessible to it before in the history of people. And so we will see, as we take a look at the history of urbanization and how we came to live together in these cities, things that we do in a week sometimes took centuries or even thousands of years to happen over time. So one of the interesting things about today is that the role of technology has played a really big role in how our identity and how we label ourselves, how we identify ourselves. Last semester, one of my other classes, I had a guest lecture from the sociology department come in and talk about the concept of social networks. And one of the things that he said that was the most interesting to the students, as I read in their idea journals, is this idea that we don't really know what this even means to have a social network of this level. Since we've never had it before, we don't even really know what this means yet. And so it's interesting and exciting as a sociologist to kind of be alive today and studying this. But think about it this way, right? So technology has changed how we create information. Prior to the internet, it used to be if you wanted to be able to get something published, to put new knowledge into the world as an academic, right? You had to go through years of schooling, become a PhD, do a recognized peer-reviewed study. You were only able to report on the findings that you were able to verify up to a certain percentage. Those became published in books and peer-reviewed journals, and that became knowledge. Well, today, of course, because we have blogs, websites, apps, et cetera, we can put things into writing very quickly that don't necessarily have any real researched academic background, right? Now, it's not to say that that information is not as important, right? So if I were to say, to tell you a traditional story about how my people believe that rainbows are roads that the gods use to travel back and forth between worlds. But yet you can take that same concept, put it in a Thor movie, call it the Bifrost, and all of a sudden everyone's on board, right? So even though that's basically essentially kind of the same idea, if it's expressed in different ways through this different technology, it can create more buy-in. Of course, the way we build and maintain friendships through social media, through platforms like we have students engaging with the class virtually rather than being face-to-face, the way we socialize and the way we disseminate information. And so all of these things, while it sounds simple is the main reason why we're actually going to create a blog as part of our midterm for this course. Because even though it sounds just so simple to create something, write something, put it on the internet, there's a lot more going on here, because not only is it an expression of you, it's an expression of your belief system at the time, the role that education had on you, right? So we're going to unpack many of those things as part of our midterm. Now, when we talk about this idea of wicked problems, right, that there's not necessarily good or bad. The internet is not good and it is not bad, but it has made some things better or worse, right? So when it comes to identity and current technology, definitely one thing that has made it better is that it is a way more level playing field to access information, where before you had traditional gatekeepers. Now, gatekeepers also were not bad or good, but there was a challenge there, because like I said, if you wanted to put knowledge out into the world, the best way to grow seeds in your backyard as part of your victory garden, right, you had to do a formal study in a peer-reviewed journal to have that published. But now, of course, you can just go online and say, hey, I live in Albuquerque. When should I be planting my pumpkins? And now you can get access to that information. So that is amazing. But one thing that's definitely made it worse is that since anyone can post questionable information to the internet that may be very misleading, derogatory, actually setting information back in a way, I mean, those gatekeepers did play a certain role as well. So definitely ease of access and delivery of information in relation to how we identify with the world has become a little bit better and worse. And speaking to that, one thing that is definitely much better is this idea that not only can I see you, but you can see me. There are no filters. So think of how possibly academics, back in the 70s used to present themselves, like these all-knowing, all-wise kind of sages of academia. Well, now, thanks to the internet and the way that I identify as an instructor at the university is much different than that kind of classic wall between us. We can actually engage more freely, share ideas. And like I said at the beginning of this class, I'm learning as much from you guys as you are from me, because just like we talked about, I don't have all of your life experiences. And so for me, being able to read and how you interpret the world around you also is teaching me at the same time. But definitely one way, of course, that's made it worse is that, predators exist online to take advantage of people who don't necessarily know how to protect themselves. So if you put too much information about yourself out there, like the names of all your grandkids, what cities they're in, lots of pictures, there's people who can get a hold of you and email you and say, oh, I'm so-and-so and your grandson Jimmy is in trouble. Send me $2,000 and I'll help him out, right? So it's really good that there's no filters, but it also can be worse. So let's shift gears a little bit. Let's relate this to the world of urban planning, right? So you've seen this slide in a past lecture when we were talking about our wicked problems within urban planning, and how a lot of these don't necessarily have beginnings and ends. They're not good or bad. It's just the idea of, well, what's actually becoming worse or better. And I want to point to this idea here that in 2009, more people in urban areas are now living in cities than in rural areas. In 2009, it crossed over to 54%, and in 2009, it was 81% of the U.S. population. With the new census that is, of course, coming out in 2020, it's going to be really interesting to see how that is shifted. Previous projections prior to the pandemic put us at around 89%, I want to believe it said, or maybe that was the 2040. So my bad, I don't remember that off the top of my head. But the point is that this idea of more people moving to the cities and how that's having an impact on our identities. And so let's think about this idea of American identities in flux, right? In the media, in news stories, certainly from various leaders, you've heard this idea of make America great again, that America has lost its identity, that too much is changing. And the interesting thing about that is you are really only hearing that from a certain generation of individuals. And so when you take a look at the life they've lived and where they may be coming from in relation to that belief, some of the data points that we use to take a look at this is this idea that back in 1960, when you take a look at the United States Census, The number of adult Americans who identified as white was 85%. In the public school system in 1960, if you were a student who identified as white, it was about 80%. Now, that's not a huge difference in percentage, but it does tell us that there's a little bit of something going on here in relation to this idea of identity expression, even back in the 60s. Now, fast forward a little bit to 2010, 50 short years later, and the number of adult Americans who are identifying as white is 72%, but in 2014, in the public schools, students who identify as white is all the way down to 49%. So the interesting thing about 2014 is that for the first time ever in our education system here in the United States, just like UNM, we had a majority minority. In the 2045, it's projected that Americans who identify as white will equal out to this number at 49% in 2045, meaning that in 2045, America itself, not just our education system, will actually become a majority minority country. Now, why is this important to urbanism? Why is this important to us who study cities as urban planners? What are the implications? Well, as more and more people are coming to the cities, and we have this kind of exponential rise in urbanism that we'll see as we take a look at the history around us, there is the reality of intermarriage. And it does illustrate how children take a different view of themselves and the world around them, and how they may actually identify themselves as a result of interracial marriage and multiculturalism, and how this is reshaping or shaping their identity. And so even back in 1960, when you think of America being a very post-war conservative place, that 5% difference, while not huge, you can even see that being represented because people were coming back from World War II, moving out to the suburbs and establishing kind of this new identity. And so today, when you are designing cities, when you're thinking about communities, people can no longer as easily categorize themselves as they did in the past. So think of the 2020 census and how you're only allowed to check one box for certain questions. Well, if you are a young person who's had your world or your identity shaped due to this much different reality, you don't really feel like you should have to socially label yourselves as one thing or another, which kind of compromises both sides of your identity. And so one interesting thing that when we take a look at the history of cities and the history of urbanism, you will actually see this play out over and over and over, where people start to come together. And once they reach a certain level of population, you can really see different shifts in their society begin to occur, which is highly relatable because we are experiencing one right now. So even though we're talking about the past, it's all very relevant. Now, the reason that this class kind of takes this approach, which is somewhat unique, because most urban planning 101 courses, we're just kind of hitting you over the head with dates, with names of famous people, looking at cities through history, giving you multiple choice exams on these things. But the reason that this class is so different is because you've heard me say this before, that UNM is the only majority minority level 1 research university in the entire United States. Well, as we just discussed, since much of the world is shifting in the way that the folks identify themselves, if you didn't know it, UNM is really the educational model for how many other US cities and other universities are looking at this idea, because for the first time ever, they are also seeing large shifts in their students identifying as something other than white. And they're not really quite sure what that means for the educational system. And so they're looking at institutions like ours. And so one thing that you guys may not know about this course is that since I've been teaching it for the last 4 to 5 years and have completely redesigned it based off my learning sciences PhD and the way that the curriculum and the education is taught, I've actually won a handful of best paper awards at academic educational conferences presenting the things that we do in this class, which is much different from a traditional experience. And the really cool thing is that you guys, even sitting here today, benefited from the students because, as you'll see through the course, there's many opportunities to comment and change things and make things a little bit better and tighter, bigger, faster, stronger. And so not only do you guys benefit from the previous students, and this is not just a standalone experience, you guys also get to contribute to this course. Those changes are always made at the end of the semester, so next time the course is offered, your guys' input is incorporated as well. And so not only is this course different, but wait a minute. If UNM or the students are majority minority, then isn't the minority the majority? But wait a minute, if we're self-identifying as the minority, then what is the, right? So what's also interesting is that the way that we are describing ourselves using this kind of terminology doesn't really match anymore, also how we are self-identifying. And so as you can kind of see by the meme here with Jackie Chan, is that when you try to organize things as classically as we have done in the past, it can sometimes be a little overwhelming and confusing. So the next thing I want to do is shift gears a little bit away from specifically this class. And I want to cover kind of a couple of isms throughout history, or offer some definitions of isms, because we are going to see these pop up and evolve throughout history. So some of those, of course, being classism, nationalism, racism, multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, which is very relatable to urban planning, and this idea of individualism. So here in the US, if you really want to think about where all these isms started for us as a country, the thing that we really want to take a look at is, prior to our current culture of individualism, people were largely organized by classism. And so when you had folks living together in cities, one of the ways that the folks were distinguished from each other is this idea of economic classism. So their idea of lords and serfs, there was the industrialist, capitalist, and the worker bees. There was always some kind of distinction through economics. But then there was also social classism as well, where even though you might be part of the working class, which at an economic level puts you at the bottom, you may come from a very proud working class background. And so suddenly on the, from a different perspective of social classism, now all of a sudden maybe you're more important than the white collar worker. So depending on these social structures, you can kind of see that different forms of classism had a different kind of impact on the way you identified. So it didn't necessarily matter how you identified, you were automatically kind of categorized into these larger groups rather than by an individual. And you will see nuances like this all throughout history, right? So for example, Karl Marx, when he was talking about Marxism and Marxist classism, he was completely focused on this relationship here of economic classism between industrialism and workers. And the way that he put this is that an individual's position within a class hierarchy is determined by their role in the production process. And the way that he kind of played it out in this dualistic nature is the idea of the proletariat, which was essentially the working class, and the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, the high society. And so his entire argument was this kind of unfair relationship. And so even though there was much bigger ways to organize people through classism, you can even see people in history really latch on to specific forms. There's also this guy named Hegel, and he took a more philosophical approach when he was talking about this idea of identity and also classism. And his two most recognized books is this idea of lordship and bondage and the phenomenology of the spirit. And essentially what he was trying to do is he was taking a look at these relationships, and I believe the translation that is more popular than lordship and bondage is master and slave, because he was taking a look at feudalism and why so few people were able to rule so many the way that they did. And his argument was that the way that we establish relationships with each other are not equal. It's just a mutual type of recognition. So if you are a serf and you are being overworked and overtaxed and living kind of a general horrible life, It's not necessarily that you were even supposed to have an equal life or an equal form of identity. That was just a type of relationship you engaged in. And so even though you may saw yourself as an important leader in the community, even though you were considered on this other structure to be lower, it was not an equal, it was just a type of relationship. And so his entire idea was that the only way identity actually occurs is that you have to recognize me for me, but I also have to recognize you for you. But because we are so busy just trying to get ourselves identified and not recognizing others, we were never able to achieve this at this time, this idea of identity. And so kind of fast forwarding a little from there, we have this idea that kind of really became prominent the way that we know it today, which was this idea of nationalism. And here in the US, our form of nationalism really came from this guy, Napoleon, out in France, when he was leading the French Revolution. Because what Napoleon did in his revolution is that he united the people of France in a way that had never really been done before. And so what he did is he kind of went out there and said, you know what, this ruling class that is controlling our lives is not representative of us. We are all French. We are one. Now, the reason that this is so significant is because in France at the time, you had all of these different social groups that did not identify themselves as solely French. So as you can see here you had the Bretons, you had the Flemings, you had the Catalans, and all these folks, while they did live within what was considered France, did not consider themselves part of the French nation. The other challenge is that also that we associate France today with the language of French, but in the time of Napoleon, only 1 in 8 people in France actually spoke French. A lot of them actually spoke their cultural languages. And so since Napoleon was able to really unite people under this idea that it doesn't matter if you identify as something else, it doesn't matter if you necessarily don't speak French, we are all French, we are all France. And so here in the US, we also kind of took that as our motto because the French Revolution, we kind of borrowed a lot of their ideas in the building and establishment of the United States. And what we did is we kind of created this idea of nationalism as we know it today. So as you can see from this image here, you can see that it's not just as simple as this is France, this is Spain, this is Great Britain, that you could be part of the same ancestral group, but then still fall back on this idea of nationalism. And so the US kind of took this as a roadmap. And so what we did is we defined nationalism as this idea of a common language, even though we did not actually make a standard of one language anywhere in the Constitution or any of our historical documents, but we did unite under this idea that we should at least have a common language to operate from. There's also this idea of ethnicity, in that a nation had to have some type of very specific border. And when you put these things together, that is what gives you a country, and therefore you can unite under that country's nationalism. And so this is all said and good, but we actually further complicated this here in the US by changing gears. So whereas much of the rest of the world still kind of used classism, still defined themselves under nationalism, something very interesting here in the US happened because we had a heavy influence of slavery in this country. So prior to slavery here in the US, classism and nationalism were pretty much the norm. But while slavery was occurring, and of course after, there became such a huge divide in wealth between the haves and the have-nots that classism no longer worked, because essentially all the white people had all the wealth and identified as American. Now, that's a very big, overgeneralized statement, but for the purposes of kind of explaining how the US changed, that's the way history and sociology likes to kind of take a look at that. So since this idea of classism no longer worked because there was such a huge number of folks that had it and those who did not, race kind of became the new way that we socially separated each other. So now all of a sudden, rather than having poor and rich, there was this new idea of black, white, and something else. And the really interesting thing about this is that in the legal doctrine and in the establishment of the writings of the United States, this idea of whiteness became a social construct here in the US. And it hadn't really happened anywhere else before, where it had actually been kind of put into this legal doctrine. And so Thomas Jefferson actually makes specific distinctions between races in his Notes of the State of Virginia, which had never really happened before from a political leader. But what was really odd about this is that while he did make certain distinctions by race, he didn't think Native Americans as a race necessarily. He thought that we were a group of people that could be saved. And this later became immortalized in R.H. Pratt, who was talking about education of Native Americans later on, that you can kill the Indian to save the man, that through education, you can assimilate them into the culture, but still save the soul, save the person. And that was really weird because as a country, not only did one of our leaders put it into writing that there should be different distinctions afforded to different people of race, he was willing to concede on one group of people. And you'll see that the U.S. has this really kind of wild, interesting relationship with Native Americans that plays out all throughout our history. Now, as you can imagine, this didn't make much sense, particularly when folks started to further immigrate over from places like Europe, because using race makes little sense to European immigrants because they're already white. So if the United States was putting it into their doctrine that to be part of the nationalist movement, to be part of American, that you had to label yourself or be recognized as a racial designation, they were already white. So they became labeled as something else, the Irish, the Italians. So we kind of brought back cultural separation as a way of kind of redefining race again in this country. But what was really kind of interesting is that a large folks immigrating over from Europe, they actually kind of chose to abandon these labels and kind of joined in on the antagonist movement against other races that were not white, because it was all kind of part of becoming the American nation. And so here in the US, not only did we kind of further make it more complicated, because not only now was there idea of the individual, your social class, your cultural ethnicity, now we were stacking race upon all the other different ways you could identify as well. And of course, for certain groups of people, it made it really even more complicated because you didn't even know about the culture, and then here you were being thrown into it. And so kind of let's wrap up by kind of talking about some more modernist ideas. So the idea of individualism. So even though individualism kind of really is rooted in the Renaissance, this idea of individualism is really kind of a social, ideological, and philosophical political movement. Because during this time, they were really favoring the role of individuals as opposed to the bigger society. And so this concept of individualism is rooted in this idea because there was so many institutions, the church, different governments, actually punishing people for being individuals. And so here in the US, one thing that also makes this really unique when we start to take a look at our cities and why we live the way that we do, we have a very particularly strong sense of individualism here because the US was a destination for people fleeing different persecutions of one or another, whether it be religious, class-based, and so on and so on. So when we take a look at why suburbs exist today, why we champion individual land ownership over other forms of being part of the land, you'll really start to see these ideas play out. Now, a more modern notion is this idea of multiculturalism that we also stack upon ourselves as this idea of the way that we identify with the world. And essentially, this idea of multiculturalism is that you can't achieve equality by being an individual, but you can do this by actually incorporating in traditionally marginalized groups, whether they be marginalized through race or their ethnocultural identity. And the really thing that's interesting about multiculturalism is it's not opposed to integration, unless it's complete assimilation, like you have to erase everything about yourself. Multiculturalism is about becoming integrated into one culture, but not abandoning the things that made you you. So it's about valuing personal diversity while also maintaining multiple identities. So you can be American, you can identify as young, while also identifying as a woman and having Scottish roots. So multiculturalism is based on this idea that there's a freedom to mix freely with anyone you want, and also to produce whatever other mixes you want to think you can produce, rather than saying that my kids can only be this. Well, there's a certain freedom there to actually express yourself in any form that you would like. And multiculturalism is challenged when you force those to identify as one thing more than another. And so you can certainly see it even today, where you are being asked to identify with the nationalist movement as being American, even though you may not necessarily like what America stands for right now. And so that can cause a lot of challenges. Now, the one that we really want to consider here when we think about urbanism, the cities, our communities, is this idea of cosmopolitanism. Because cosmopolitanism is this idea that we are citizens of the world. We should be able to free to live, work, and travel wherever we want, and therefore, in support of such globalism, we should eliminate national borders. Because it is no longer the distinction of nations, it is no longer the distinctions of countries, is that we are truly cosmopolitan. We are truly citizens of urbanism, that we have the ability to hop on multiple forms of transportation, and any city that we land in is therefore the life of the urbanist, the life of the cosmopolitan. And so being able to go out, work a day job, go downtown to the bar after work is something that unites us universally through our urbanism. So rather than this whole idea of culture, context, multiculturalism, identity, we're really cosmopolitan. We're citizens of the world. Now, all of these ideas sound fairly simple to recognize. But as urban planners, or as part of any community, the challenge is always what is inherent in acquired identity? Because can you really look at somebody and understand everything about them, right? So inherent identity, what's obvious? Well, if I were to look at this painting from, I think it's 1966, René, his last name's escaping me, was a Belgian surrealist painter. This is the Faceless Businessman. And so you can kind of see here that what is inherent or what is obvious is he appears to be male, he appears to be businessman, he appears to be part of the middle or upper middle class based off his dress. There seems to be some sort of time for leisure or the ability for leisure because he's standing there with the ocean behind him. But what is his acquired identity? What is not obvious? What is his level of education? Does he have a family? What is his social and political beliefs, right? And so one of the things that's challenging is when you take a look at these ideas of cosmopolitanism, multicultural, et cetera, is that you can't just simply judge any of these things by looking at somebody. You have to get to know the person. And one of the challenges is that it takes time to get to know people, which is not always something that we have the ability to do. Now, even though all of these different isms can feel very far away, like Marxism doesn't really feel like it's a part of our society, we can see these all the time. So classism, you can certainly see that today in these ideas that we have of celebrity, the Hollywood star, reality TV, right? There's a certain kind of social class above just us sitting in this room. And that's kind of an acceptance that we have. You can certainly see Marxism, right? There's still this relationship between economic, social classism, the blue collar, the white collar, workers' rights, unions, things of this nature. Nationalism, you certainly see that prevalent in the last decade here, this idea of make America great again, this idea that everyone should only speak English, even though the US has no official language. Racism, of course, that's something we struggle with very predominantly. Just turn on the 6 o'clock news. Cosmopolitanism, while that feels very distant, if you can travel by plane, if you can afford to travel by plane, if you have a passport, if you've actually navigated bureaucracy successfully in a way that you can travel by plane, you are considered cosmopolitan because you can pick up in one city, land in another, and have that shared urban experience. And then, of course, individualism, freedom from state control, my life to live. Very much an American ideal, but of course tied to larger democratic beliefs and seen all around the world. So even though a lot of these isms feel like they're very specific things that aren't necessarily part of our everyday life, they're pretty much everywhere. So to kind of wrap up here, what is this nuance for planners? What does all this idea of identity and social theory mean to us? Well, even though, like I said, it takes a little time to get to know people, it can provide insight into the community that you're planning for. So for example, here in New Mexico, if you're doing some planning work up in northern New Mexico, and folks may identify themselves as norteños, and maybe they do have very conservative belief systems, they do not see themselves as part of Mexico at any point in their history. They clearly identify themselves as descendants of the Spanish Empire, who was in the area at one time. As you listen to people talk in these different communities, it does provide you a certain type of insight, so you can't just generally apply certain planning principles to them. And in a globalized society, we are all trying to maintain our independent community ideas. And so as we've kind of talked about before, that even in the same city, we have these niches or these neighborhoods that all want to have certain economic prosperity, but also at the same time want to maintain their individuality. And so the most common experience we have, of course, here in Albuquerque is this idea of Borellis down by the rail yards, who wants to share in the same type of walkability, certain type of economic opportunities that Nob Hill has, but they do not want to lose their Borellis identity. And so they're trying to navigate having the best of both worlds there in their independent communities. And then the other challenging thing is that every single one of us, we're trying to maintain our individual identity in this giant steady syrup flow that is the internet. And so not only as planners are we trying to pick up on nuances of the community that we're engaged with, we're also trying to make sure that they maintain their individual identity in these communities while also benefiting from certain changes. But at the same time, we're also trying to make sure that we stay the type of planners that we want to be as we engage with the city around us. And so for closing circle today, to kind of wrap things up, as you guys can see, humans can easily complicate the social world around us. Now, nothing that we've talked about today is good or bad, but there's definitely better or worse aspects about all of these things. But there's nothing wrong with having different beliefs and different interpretations. And that's kind of the real idea of this multiculturalistic view that we have here in the US, is that if you have a business, it's not just that you're hiring people of color or more women, but that you're actually hiring people with different beliefs and backgrounds and views. Because if you just keep hiring the same version of yourself in other people, you're not really expanding your toolbox. You're just basically filling it with hammers of different shapes and sizes and colors. But a hammer just keeps doing the same work over and over. It can only hammer a nail and it can't undo a bolt. It can't, put in a screw. So it's this idea that there's nothing wrong with having different beliefs and interpretations of the world, right? We're all working to become self-conscious. By seeking out others of like mind, we can co-construct our identities. So think back to that kind of philosophical argument that Hegel was presenting, which is this idea that you cannot actually exist because if I don't recognize you and you don't recognize me, then neither of us exist. But if we can co-construct this through our communities, the way we design our cities, we as planners have a real opportunity to kind of engage in these larger structures. And of course, there's nothing wrong with parents having different hopes and standards for daughters than they do their sons. But as we've just talked about, it's when you pit the two against each other and imply or that state that different sides need to be chosen, that if you are a daughter, you can only be one way. And so there's nothing wrong that if you choose to have a certain type of life, your parents have different expectations of you. It's this idea of when we pit them against each other, that one is more important and better than the other, that everyone should have or be living the same way. That's when it becomes really problematic. So just to summarize the first module, since we do have our first reflection and synthesis assignment coming due Sunday, which we're about to talk about next. If you kind of had to wrap up module one, we kind of talked about this idea of science versus philosophy, this idea of what we believe in and what is true and we can reproduce versus the philosophical approach of how we should live together, why we should live together. Ethics versus aesthetics. So it's not just that I should be building a community that is the most ethical and equal and economical way for everybody, but it's also that it should be nice. It should look nice. There should be a certain type of aesthetic beauty to it as well. Because if we just wanted to keep people safe from the elements, we would just build boxes on top of each other with no windows, and there would be no sense of architectural design or art. But we kind of balance the two. Wicked problems are always for better or for worse, not right or wrong. Even if an age is ending and you feel really uncertain about the world today, don't worry, we've been here before. Affordances of the natural and in synthetic world are intertwined. They are one of the same, even though this desk, this carpet, this concrete wall around us feels very artificial. It all came from natural states of the world around us. This idea of sustainability, that humans kind of see ourselves as superior, but we are not, and that the earth does not offer us unlimited affordances. There is a limit. The world is shaped by humans for humans. We don't design the world around us for ants, for our pets. We largely design it for us. But the thing to kind of end on is that if we made this world and it's not working well for us, that also means we have the ability to make it different, that we can actually cause real change. And so starting next week on Tuesday, we'll start diving into the history of the world around us and how cities came to be and how different cultures left their mark upon the world that actually formulated why we are sitting in this classroom, why we are listening to this lecture virtually, why we are participating in the world around us the way that we are. So, any questions about anything we just talked about today? I know today was kind of broad and lots of different topics thrown at you because we're trying to scratch the surface of a lot of different things so we can start to introduce them throughout the history in the coming weeks. But does anyone have any questions? And those of you watching the class virtually, I can see you using the chat. Thank you very much for doing so. If you have any questions as well, please leave them in the chat. And after our class is over, when I go back and watch this video, I'll be happy to address those as well. Those of you watching this video after the fact, maybe sometime later tonight or in the coming days, you could also email me questions as well. All right, so just a reminder for looking ahead, this coming Sunday, we got a couple parts in the book to read. We also have our upcoming reflection and synthesis #1 assignment. And then we also have an extra credit opportunity coming up where you can upload your profile pic to learn. I will send out the instructions on how to do that and learn after this class today in the early afternoon. But for now, let's touch upon this idea of the first assignment, the reflection and synthesis, because these are kind of the main assignments other than the exams for this course. So these assignments, what makes them really different is that your idea journals are designed for you to just react based off your personal beliefs, by your life experience, et cetera, et cetera. And so these idea journals that you've already had one do so far allow you to kind of openly convey your feelings on topics without any real structure. But the reflection and synthesis assignments ask you to convey these same personal impacts, what you personally found interesting, in a more organized way. And it's through this idea of reflection and synthesis. So let me jump over to Learn real quick, and let's go over that. And to do so, I'm just going to pull up the course syllabus. Yeah, make that any bigger. Yep, as big as it gets. All right, so reflection and synthesis. You have your first one due this coming Sunday. They are 400 words plus or minus 10 words. And so you've seen this pop up before. And essentially what this is that we are learning to write in a very specific style, because when most students, or most people for that matter, are given a really open platform, sometimes, as you've seen in conferences or people giving presentations in class, they go way over their amount of time that they talk, or they use too little, right? So this is kind of a way for us to practice being concise in a certain space, because as you'll see, our midterm assignment down here is 800 words plus or minus. And so we're kind of getting used to this writing style as we work towards that. So reflection and synthesis. Students will pick a topic or topics covered on a semi-weekly basis. So anything that we've talked about in the last 2 weeks is completely up for game. And you can personally choose whatever it is in these last 2 weeks that you have found interesting, and discuss that topic both academically, i.e. synthesis, and personally, i.e. through reflection. So for a synthesis portion of this assignment, it's kind of that classic third-party academic writing that you guys have always been taught to do, right? So you introduce the topic, right? This week in my CRP.165 class here at the University of New Mexico, the topic I found to be the most interesting was blank. And the reason that I found this interesting is because, and this is where your personal reflection comes in, right? So usually the way synthesis works is you introduce a topic, define what it means. And so let's say, for example, we introduced this idea of wicked problems, right? So if wicked problems is the topic that you found interesting, don't just say, I found wicked problems interesting. Offer a definition. Because essentially what you're doing is you're writing for somebody who has possibly never seen this class before. And so you want to be able that you convey information in a meaningful way. So introduce the topic, define what it means, and then discuss the topic within the larger urban planning context from a third person point of view. So urbanism is when blank happens. Back during the 16th century, urbanism was founded on the idea of, right, so it's that classic kind of academic way of writing. And what you want to do is bring in 2 citations from the reading that you have assigned for the week. So from those 4 sections of the book, bring in any 2 examples that support anything that you're discussing. And then you'll cite them using APA style. And if you don't know what that is, I will also send some links as to what APA style is for these citations. So basically the thing to keep in mind for synthesis writing is that this writing style is typically used throughout academia and allows you to write about topics from a distance. Third-party pronouns usually include he, him, his, it, she, itself, them, theirs, themselves, right? Because you're referring to something else. And then you kind of shift gears about halfway through this assignment and you switch to the reflection portion. And this is where you discuss why this topic impacted you personally enough to write about it using first-person language. I, me, myself, right? And this second part looks a little bit more like an idea journal. It's your chance to say, this is why I found this important or interesting. So for roughly about 200 words, right, since this is a 400-word assignment, think of it like half and half, even though obviously you do not have to do half and half. So for the first part, introduce your topic, define what it means, what is this topic in history, and then about halfway through, And the reason I found this topic so interesting to me personally is because when I was growing up, I didn't really understand why my town was designed in this way. But as we discussed this topic in class and read about it, it became more right. So you're relating it to your life. Now, the reason that we're using this idea of reflection and synthesis is because we're building two different ideas here. One is that kind of classic academic engagement where you're discussing topics as you would as if you were writing a final exam or a quiz, right? It's that classic kind of engagement. But then you're also making it personable. So this information is not just floating out there by itself where you're offering definitions, offering citations. You're actually discussing why it was important to you enough to write about it for your assignment. And so if you have questions about that, of course, please feel free to reach out to me. If any of that is unclear, I will help you out as much as I can through email or whatever. Give me a call, schedule a Zoom if you're having any trouble with that. Any questions about that? No, so you can absolutely build. So the question was, can this assignment build from your idea journal? And absolutely. So if the thing that you found interesting from class in the last 2 weeks is the same thing you want to write about for your reflection, absolutely. You can keep the same topic. You can't copy and paste in the same text from the idea journal, but you can go back and rewrite it and refine and kind of convey that idea a little bit more clearly, basically. Go back and re-edit it for the reflection portion of this assignment. For those of you participating virtually, if you have any questions in the chat, I'll get back to you after class as well. Any other questions from the folks in the room? Okay. So to wrap things up today, I wanted to introduce this activity called Who Am I? And there's some handouts in the back of the room if you'd like to grab one to participate in class. There's actually some right behind you on that table, so you can grab those. Grab one of those. For those of you participating virtually, this PDF is available on our Learn site in week 2 under this class. And so for the purposes of this activity, in the center circle, you will see, hi, my name is blank, and I am a blank. So what I would like you to do is write in your name for the first line, but before you fill out the second line, I want you to complete the circles around the hi, my name is. And I want you to fill it in with 6 different ways that you identify as an individual. So perhaps if you are native New Mexican, and maybe sometimes you introduce yourselves as, hi, my name is blank, and I am a native New Mexican, right? That's a type of greeting you may use. So go ahead and fill out those circles around the main circle here. I am going to throw on some Beatles in the background and give this about 2 minutes, so that way we can come back together and wrap things up. So about 2 minutes to do this activity. If you're participating virtually, again, you can get a copy of that PDF online on our Learn site under week 2 under today's lecture. All right, so let's come back together. So in relation to what we talked about today, in this idea of this individual identity matrix, right? In the center circle, you have your name, and then around it, you kind of have your go-to metrics, the way you introduce yourself when you meet someone new. So for example, out of all of the circles that I have available here around me, for instance, my name is Jordan and I'm Native American. I am a full-time PhD student. I am a rock and roll drummer. Any of those things that I might use to introduce myself, my main go-to whenever I meet somebody is, hi, my name is Jordan and I'm a lecturer of urban planning at the University of New Mexico. Now, even though I identify as all these other different circles around me, the reason that this is usually my go-to introduction is because this is the context in which I am most commonly in. At the university, surrounded by students, engaging and talking about urban planning and other academic subjects, right? But my identity is also more than that. So for you guys and those of you participating virtually, if you would like to say, hi, my name is, put your name in and use any of the bubbles or circles around you to introduce yourself in that way, please do so. But for those of you here in class, essentially the main important thing here is that we need to recognize that our individual identities are comprised of a variety of metrics, right? So the second I leave UNM, or the second if I'm going on vacation, am I going to keep introducing myself in this manner? Probably not. My favorite thing to do is when I go to the East Coast to say, hey, my name is Jordan James and I'm from New Mexico. Because the thing that happens over and over and over is people will say, wow, you speak really good English for being from Mexico, or was it hard to get into the country? And I get to have a little fun and say, you do know New Mexico is in between Texas and Arizona and right below Colorado, right? Like it's part of the US. Like I did not need a passport to get here. So Albuquerque is a real city and not just in a Bugs Bunny cartoon. So depending on where I'm at, I get to have a little fun. Now, that doesn't mean that because I didn't introduce myself as an academic that my identity is less. It's just different to the context. And so normally what we would do is we would actually try these out as part of our everyday person introductions. But of course, with the pandemic and social distancing, I would rather just make this as an example and for you guys to have done this activity rather than us actually going around right now. And so as we think about who we are in relationship to the world around us, when we start to take a look at the history of cities, you'll also see that this relationship has changed quite a bit as well. So one thing I would tell you to do is that even though it may be, of course, with circumstances now to kind of use these as the way you introduce yourself, try using this out loud with your friends or family or the people in your social structures that you trust. Try introducing yourself in a way to them that you would never do and see how they react to those identity markers. And maybe think about the way next time you introduce yourself, why did you do it that way? And what was the social situation calling for? So that's all I have for today. This is kind of a more common approach to class where rather than ending early, we usually end right about on time with the way things are timed out. So. But of course, with the way that's designed is, of course, by doing more of these activities. And of course, that's going to change a little bit due to the current pandemic. So we'll see how that goes. We may occasionally end early from time to time. But thank you guys very much for making it to face-to-face class. I really appreciate you guys being here. I think if I was standing here just talking to the camera, it'd probably be a little weird. But at the same time, you guys participating virtually, I really enjoy going back and watching these videos and being able to watch the chat appear as I lecture as well. So thank you to both of you guys. If you have any questions about the assignment on Sunday, please let me know. And other than that, thank you very much. Have a good weekend, guys.